The horses that carry the household cavalry through the streets of London do not arrive brave. They arrive young and green and startled by plastic bags. Bravery is not a trait, it is a program. A precise, carefully sequenced series of exposures, flags, then music, then crowd noise, then all three simultaneously, designed to rewire the animal's threat response until the things that should terrify it have become, through repetition and trust, simply Tuesday. Get the sequence right, and you have a horse that will stand motionless at the center of a brass band, while 10,000 people press against the barriers, and a police helicopter circles overhead. Get it wrong, and you have something far more dangerous than an untrained horse. You have a horse that has learned the wrong thing, completely correctly. Thomas Aldridge learned this distinction on a Tuesday. The behavioral assessment form had 12 fields. Thomas had filled out 11 of them in under 4 minutes, which was either a sign that he was efficient or a sign that Orbit was the most straightforwardly healthy horse he'd assessed since joining the Mounted Regiment civilian contractor team 6 days ago. He was leaning toward the latter. The stallion was a picture. 4 years old, coat so black it looked photoshopped, standing at 16-2 hands with the kind of relaxed weight distribution that meant good feet and a quiet nervous system. He moved well on the lunge. He accepted the bit without argument. He stood tied at the rail while 2 farriers worked 3 stalls down, metal on metal, and didn't so much as shift his weight. Thomas was reaching for field 12, response to novel stimuli, controlled environment, when the wind came through the yard. It wasn't a dramatic wind. It was the kind that arrives in early April in London without warning, skipping over the barracks wall and catching the row of regimental flags mounted along the south fence. The flags snapped. One full crack, like a rifle going off, and then the sustained flutter of heavy fabric suddenly under pressure. Orbit's head came up. Thomas had his clipboard at mid-chest. He kept it there and watched. The horse's ears went flat, then forward, then flat again. His nostrils widened. His weight shifted, not backward, not the classic flea preparation load onto the haunches that Thomas had been trained to recognize. Something else. The horse dropped his head 4 inches and blew out through his nose, a long, deliberate exhalation. Then he turned his head away from the flags entirely and looked at the far stable wall. Thomas stood very still for another 30 seconds. In a horse 8 months into a desensitization program, that response was not a problem. A horse 8 months in should have processed that flag snap and returned to neutral within 2 seconds, head level, attention wandering, already bored by it. What Thomas had just watched was not neutrality. It was management. The horse had felt something, recognized it as significant, and made a decision to look away from it. That was not a trained response. That was a coping behavior. Thomas put his pen to field 12, wrote 4 words, and then stared at them. Does not match program. He almost crossed it out. He was 6 days in. The stable sergeant had introduced him to the regiment's 3 senior riders in a single corridor handshake on day 2, and 2 of them hadn't asked his name. His office was a repurposed tack room with a space heater that smelled of old saddle soap. He had no authority here, no history here, and no particular desire to spend his first week filing flags on horses that 12 other people had already signed off as ready. He looked at Orbit. Orbit was looking at the stable wall. Thomas wrote the behavioral flag and submitted it before he could change his mind. The flag landed on Gerald Foss's desk at 11:14 on a Wednesday morning because Gerald Foss had, 3 months prior, convinced someone at the Ministry of Defense that all pre-event animal welfare documentation should route through his office for scheduling integration purposes. Nobody had fully understood what that meant. Gerald understood it to mean that he now had visibility on anything that might threaten his timeline. He was, by his own description, a logistics professional. By the regiment's description, offered in the informal economy of the barracks mess, He was a man who had attended one equine behavior conference in Bristol in 2019 and had not stopped referencing it since. The conference had featured a 40-slide PowerPoint by a Dutch researcher on stress indicators in performance horses. Gerald had taken 11 pages of notes. He referenced them the way other people reference scripture. He read Thomas's flag in under a minute, set it face down on his desk, and picked up his phone. The call to the stable office lasted 4 minutes. Gerald spoke for 3.5 of them. The words new contractor, adjustment period, understandable overcaution, and Dutch study on novel stimuli thresholds all appeared. The stable sergeant, a man named Ron Cathcart who had been managing horses at Hyde Park Barracks for 19 years and had the forearms to prove it, held the phone 6 inches from his ear and stared at the ceiling. When Gerald finished, Ron said, "Right." Then he hung up and called Major Elinor Voss. He did not explain why. He simply read her Thomas's 4 words over the phone. "Does not match program." There was a silence on the line. "Which horse?" Elinor said. "Orbit, the 4-year-old. 8 months in, due on the rehearsal roster in 3 weeks." Another silence, longer. "Pull his file," she said. "Don't let anyone else touch it. I'll be there at 6. Ron looked at the clock. It was 4:47 in the afternoon. "6 tomorrow," he said. "6 tomorrow," Elinor confirmed. "Morning." She was there at 5:45. Elinor Voss did not look like someone who had spent 30 years inside the British Army's mounted regiment. She looked like someone who might teach secondary school mathematics, compact, unhurried, reading glasses on a lanyard, sensible boots. The kind of woman who appeared unremarkable until she opened her mouth or stood near a horse, at which point something shifted in the air around her, and people tended to move out of her way without quite knowing why. She arrived in the yard before the horses were brought out, stood at the rail of Orbit's stable, and watched him eat. She did not make notes. She did not have a clipboard. She watched the way he moved around the hay, the way he positioned himself relative to the stable door, the way his ears tracked sounds from the yard outside. She watched the small behavioral vocabulary of a horse in a familiar space, the micro-expressions that most people walked past every morning without reading. After 40 minutes, Ron brought her the training file. Elinor opened it at the standing rail and read it the way a doctor reads a chart backwards, from the most recent entry toward the beginning, looking for the moment where the story changed. She found it on page 11. Week 14 of the desensitization program. A notation in a different hand from the primary trainer who had been on leave. Substituted Phase 3 flags protocol with Phase 4 crowd noise sequence per schedule requirement. Horse responsive. Continuing. Elinor read it twice. Then she turned to the beginning of the file and read the program sequence aloud to herself, quietly, her finger moving down the page. Phase 1, individual flag exposure static. Phase 2, individual flag exposure movement. Phase 3, multiple flags movement with handler present. Phase 4, crowd noise recorded low volume. Phase 5, crowd noise recorded high volume. Phase 6, flags and crowd noise simultaneously. Phase 7, live band distance. Phase 8, live band proximity with flags. Phase 9, full ceremonial simulation. The substitute trainer had skipped Phase 3 and moved directly to Phase 4. It had seemed reasonable. Orbit was doing well. The schedule required Phase 4 to begin that week. Phase 3 and Phase 4 didn't appear to overlap. Flags were flags. Crowd noise was crowd noise. The trainer had made a professional judgment call based on a scheduling pressure. The problem was that Phase 3 was not about flags. Phase 3 was about teaching the horse to process multiple simultaneous visual threats while a trusted human was physically present. It was the bridge phase, the one that taught the horse that the human beside him was the source of safety when the environment became complicated. Without Phase 3, All subsequent training had been built on a foundation that looked solid but had a gap in it. Orbit had learned to tolerate crowd noise, live bands, flags at distance, flags up close, and all of them together. He had learned all of it competently. He had simply learned it without the anchor. He was, in the technical language of equine behavioral science, stimulus habituated but not handler bonded under stress, which meant he had learned to manage, not to trust. And the difference between those two things, on a live ceremonial route with 40,000 people and a full military band, was the difference between a controlled horse and a horse making its own decisions in a crowd. Elinor closed the file. "Where's the contractor?" she said. Ron looked up from the hay net he was securing. "Aldridge, TAC room." "Get him," she said, "and tell no one else about this file until I say otherwise." Ron nodded and went. Elinor turned back to Orbit, who had finished his breakfast and was standing at the stable door looking at her with the calm, cooperative expression of a horse that had absolutely no idea what he just cost 3 people their morning. The briefing room at the Ministry of Defense offices on Whitehall smelled of carpet cleaner and institutional coffee, and the particular kind of anxiety that gathers in rooms where schedules are treated as moral documents. Gerald Foss had arranged the chairs. This was, Elinor had come to understand in the 2 days since she'd filed the formal removal request, a power move. Gerald arranged chairs the way other men arranged arguments, positioning himself at the head of a rectangular table, placing Thomas and Elinor on one side, leaving the brigadier's chair pointedly empty at the far end, as if its vacancy were an accusation. Gerald had a folder. He had a printed agenda. He had, visibly, the 2019 conference notes. "I want to say at the outset," Gerald began, in the tone of a man who had rehearsed this opening, "that I have enormous respect for the regiment's expertise. Enormous. And I want to be clear that this conversation is not adversarial." Elinor said nothing. "My concern," Gerald continued, "is proportionality. We have a horse that passed all primary assessments. We have a behavioral notation, and I don't mean this dismissively from a contractor in his first week on site. And we have a rehearsal roster with a confirmed gap if Orbit is pulled, 3 weeks out from a nationally televised event." He opened the conference folder. Elinor watched him open it the way you watch someone reach for an umbrella when what's coming is not rain. "The Dutch study, and I'm sure you're familiar with it, Major, the Vandermeer study, Bristol 2019, specifically addresses substitute sequencing in performance animal training and finds that the—" "Thomas," Elinor said. Thomas, who had been sitting very still with the expression of a man trying to become architecturally part of the chair, looked up. "Tell him what you saw in the yard, specifically." Thomas set down his pen. He was 34 years old and had a postgraduate degree in equine behavioral science from the Royal Veterinary College, and had spent the last 48 hours reading everything ever written about handler bonding under stress in military horses. And he had also spent those same 48 hours being absolutely certain he was about to be fired. "The flag snap response," he said. "In a horse 8 months into program, correctly trained, you see reorientation within 2 seconds, back to neutral. The threat is processed and filed. What I saw was displacement. He looked away from the stimulus. That's a management behavior, not a habituated response. He's been coping with stimuli rather than processing them because the handler bonding phase was skipped. On a live route at full ceremonial intensity, when something unexpected hits, and something always hits, a crowd barrier coming down, a microphone feedback squeal, a child running into the street, he won't look to the rider. He'll manage. And when management fails—" He stopped. "When management fails," Elinor finished, "the horse decides. And a 16-hand horse in a crowd of 40,000 people deciding things is not a scheduling problem. It is a medical emergency." Gerald looked at his folder. "The Vandermeer study specifically." Gerald, Aliner's voice did not rise. It simply became more precise, the way a lens becomes more precise when correctly focused. The Vandermeer study was conducted on dressage horses in controlled arena environments. It has no applicability to ceremonial route work. I know this because I was asked to peer review it in 2020 and I recommended it not be published in its current form. It was published anyway. This is a separate issue. Gerald opened his mouth. The door opened. Brigadier Helen Carroll did not arrange chairs when she entered a room. She simply entered it, and the room reorganized itself around her presence, the way water reorganizes itself around a stone dropped into it. Not dramatically, not with noise, just a change in the surface pattern that indicated something of significant mass had arrived. She was 61. She wore her uniform the way civilians wear comfortable old coats. She had a cup of tea in her hand, no folder, no printed agenda, and the expression of a woman who had been in this specific meeting, with this specific category of argument, approximately 40 times before. She sat at the end of the table. She looked at Gerald. "You coordinated the 2021 beating retreat rehearsal," she said. It was not a question. "I did," Gerald said, with the slight expansion of a man whose credentials are being acknowledged. "Were you present when the gray mare came down on Constitution Hill?" Gerald's expansion reversed itself. That was a separate, the assessment on that horse was. "Were you present?" Helen repeated. "No," Gerald said. Helen nodded once and turned to Thomas. "Walk me through the specific failure point, not the theory, the specific moment in sequence on a live route where this horse's training gap becomes a physical event." Thomas had not expected to be addressed first. He picked up his pen, put it down, and spoke. "The route turns onto the mall from Horse Guards. There are barriers on both sides from St. James's Park end, crowds maybe 4 deep, band already playing at full volume. At that point in the route, the stimuli are all known quantities. He's been trained on all of them individually and in combination. He's managing fine. Then something breaks sequence. Doesn't matter what, it could be a flag mounting coming loose on the barrier, a camera on a pole swinging into his eyeline, a child with a balloon, anything that wasn't in the training environment. A correctly handler-bonded horse checks in with the rider. The rider is the reference point. The rider says, with body and weight and seat, "We are fine." The horse accepts that and continues. He paused. Orbit checks in with nobody. He has never been taught that the rider is the reference point under stress. He's been taught that stress is manageable through avoidance. When avoidance isn't available, when he's in a closed ceremonial column with barriers on both sides and 40,000 people, avoidance becomes lateral movement. Lateral movement at pace in a closed column means the horse beside him goes down or the rider goes off or both. The room was quiet. Helen looked at Gerald. Gerald looked at his folder. "The gap in formation," he said. His voice had lost about 40% of its earlier certainty. "The optics of a gap in them." "A gap in formation," Helen said, "is a scheduling inconvenience. A horse coming down on Constitution Hill is a newspaper front page and a parliamentary inquiry." She set her tea down. "How long does the correction take?" 6 weeks minimum, Aliner said. "Full phase 3 sequence, correctly run, then a staged reintegration of subsequent phases to ensure handler bonding is established before we expose him to full simulation again." "Is the horse salvageable for the full ceremonial program after that?" "Yes," Aliner said, "if the 6 weeks are not compressed." Helen looked at Gerald. "Orbit comes off the roster. You have 3 weeks to fill the gap from the reserve pool. I suggest you begin that conversation with the stable sergeant this afternoon, as he has been waiting for your call since yesterday morning." Gerald said nothing. "The contractor's flag was correct," Helen continued, with the finality of someone closing a file rather than a debate. "File it as a program audit finding, not an individual notation. That protects the regiment and it protects him. A brief pause. It also protects you, Gerald, from having signed off on a schedule that contained a training gap. I'd suggest you consider that a courtesy." Gerald nodded just once. The conference folder closed. Thomas realized he had been holding his breath for approximately 90 seconds and quietly released it into his shirt collar. Alina was already standing. The reassignment notice reached Gerald Foss's desk on a Thursday. Indoor logistics, ceremonial coordination, non-animal departments. The language was administrative and bloodless, restructured portfolio, enhanced focus on infrastructure components, and Gerald, to his credit, did not contest it. He cleared his office over a weekend and left the 2019 conference notes in the top drawer of his desk, where a facilities clerk would eventually throw them away without reading them. Ron Cathcart spent a single afternoon rebuilding the rehearsal roster around the gap. He had been expecting to do this since Wednesday of the previous week. Thomas Aldridge was given a formal written authorization, countersigned by Alina and Helen both, to run Orbit's corrective program from inception. 6 weeks. Phase 3 to be completed in full before any progression. No schedule pressure. No deadline notation. Just a horse, a handler, and a flag. The first session was a Thursday morning. Low cloud. Temperature around 8 degrees. Thomas walked Orbit out to the yard on a long line and stood with him at the south fence while the regimental flags moved in the wind. Not snapping today. A gentler morning. Just the slow, heavy billow of fabric under mild pressure. Thomas stood at Orbit's shoulder, weight easy, breathing deliberately slow, and let the horse look. Orbit's ears moved toward the flags. His nostrils worked. Thomas did nothing, made no correction, offered no reassurance, applied no pressure. He was simply present and calm and consistent, the way the program required. After 6 minutes, Orbit's head dropped 2 inches. Not avoidance, not management, the beginning of something more like acceptance. Thomas noted the time in his file and made no other notation. There was nothing dramatic to record. The work of trust doesn't look like anything from the outside. It looks like a man standing in a cold yard next to a horse watching a flag, doing nothing in particular for the 14th session in a row. Alina arrived at the yard on the second week and watched from the gate for 20 minutes without announcing herself. She made one note, showed it to nobody, and left before Thomas saw her. The note read, "Correct." By week 4, Orbit was walking a flag-lined corridor with Thomas at his shoulder, band music playing from a Bluetooth speaker at the far end, while 2 stable hands ran alongside making crowd noise by clapping and shouting. On the first attempt, he shortened his stride. On the second, he flicked an ear toward Thomas. On the third, he walked the full length without alteration. Thomas noted the time, made no other observation, walked him back to his stable and gave him half an apple, which was not in the program documentation, but which Thomas decided fell within the spirit of it. By week 6, the sessions had migrated from the barracks yard to the Knightsbridge route itself. Alina had requested a 40-minute early morning window before traffic, with 4 regiment members running the full ceremonial simulation. Flags on barriers. A 6-piece brass section from the Household Cavalry Band. 2 noise engineers with speakers mounted on a flatbed, running a recorded crowd track at event volume. The request had gone up through 3 administrative layers. It had come back approved with a single annotation, Brigadier Caro personal sign-off, no schedule variance permitted. They ran the simulation on the 43rd day. The morning was cold and gray, and specifically London, in the way that only early May in London is not unpleasant, just present. The city going about its business at low volume, while a small group of people stood on Knightsbridge with a horse and waited. Thomas stood at the barrier on the south side of the route. Alina stood beside him. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing useful to say. The work was either done or it wasn't, and talking about it in the next 4 minutes was not going to change which of those things was true. The rider, a corporal named James Whitfield, who had been assigned to orbit for the final 3 weeks of corrective training, and who had spent those 3 weeks developing the specific physical vocabulary of trust that the program required, walked the horse to the start point at the Brompton Road end. Orbit was wearing full ceremonial tack. Black saddle, polished to the point of being faintly ridiculous, breastplate, the tall regimental plume. He looked exactly like what he was, a young horse dressed up in the most visually complicated outfit ever devised by people who wanted to impress other people. And he was standing at the start of a flag-lined route with a brass band warming up 40 meters ahead, and a crowd track already running from the flatbed speakers at moderate volume. His ears were forward. Not flat, not wide with alarm. Forward, the way a horse's ears go when it is paying close attention to something it has decided is worth attending to. Whitfield settled in the saddle and walked him forward. The first flag barrier was 8 meters in. Heavy fabric, regimental colors, mounted on a steel pole and moving in the morning air with the exact same motion as the south fence flags in the barracks yard, where Thomas had stood for 6 sessions, watching a horse learn to look at something without looking away from it. Orbit walked past it. His stride didn't shorten. His head didn't come up. One ear tracked the flag the way an ear will track any sound or movement with attention, not alarm. The other ear stayed on Whitfield. The band started. Not at full volume, they built it, the way the program specified, starting at 60% and moving to full over 90 seconds. The sound came up the street like weather, big and brass and entirely unreasonable in a residential area at 7 in the morning. Thomas watched Orbit's top line for the first sign of tension across the back, the tell that precedes the decision, and saw none. Then the crowd noise came up from the flatbed. 40,000 people, compressed into a speaker system on a flatbed truck, doing what 40,000 people do at a ceremony, cheering, shifting, making the collective noise of a crowd that doesn't know it's frightening horses and wouldn't modify its behavior if it did. The sound hit the buildings on both sides of Knightsbridge and bounced back and became omnidirectional in the way that crowd noise on a ceremonial route is always omnidirectional, not coming from any one place, just present, surrounding, inescapable. Orbit's pace held. He walked the flags. He walked the band. He walked the crowd noise. And when a flag mounting on Barrier 14, loosened by someone's elbow during setup, dropped with a sharp metallic crack, the exact category of unexpected stimulus, the broken sequence event, the one Thomas had described in the briefing room as the moment the gap becomes a physical event. Orbit's head came up for exactly 1 second, one ear swiveling hard toward the sound, weight loaded briefly onto the haunches in the old preparatory way. And then Whitfield shifted his seat by half an inch, and moved his left hand an inch along the rein, and said nothing, and did nothing else. Orbit checked in. He felt the weight in the hand and the absolute quietness of the body above him, and read it the way he had been taught, over 6 weeks of standing in cold yards with a flag and a man who was simply present, to read it. "We are fine." The horse's head came down. His pace resumed. He walked to the end of the route, turned at the bollard and walked back. Nobody applauded. This was not that kind of moment. Ron Cathcart, watching from the gate with his arms crossed and his face arranged into its habitual expression of a man who has seen too much to be visibly moved by anything, allowed himself a single nod. Whitfield brought Orbit back to the start point and dismounted with the economical movement of someone who had just done something significant and intended to treat it as routine. Thomas had his clipboard at his side. He had been holding it since the start of the simulation and had not written a single word on it. Alina had been standing beside him for the same duration and had said nothing. She watched Whitfield bring Orbit to a halt. She watched the horse stand, reins loose, plumes stirring in the morning air, in the middle of Knightsbridge with the flag barriers still up, and the crowd noise still running from the flatbed, and the band packing away their instruments on the pavement 40 meters up the road. Standing easy, present. She turned to Thomas. "He's ready," she said. 4 words. Thomas looked at the horse. He thought about a Tuesday in April, a flag snapping in a yard, a 4-word notation on a form that 6 different people had looked at, and one person had looked at differently. He thought about a briefing room on Whitehall that smelled of carpet cleaner, and a Dutch study that had nothing to do with anything, and a woman who had arrived at a stable at 5:45 in the morning to watch a horse eat breakfast for 40 minutes before she was willing to say a single word about what was wrong with it. He thought about the difference between a horse that manages and a horse that trusts, and how from the outside, on a good day, they look identical. "He was always ready," Thomas said. "We just had to teach him the right thing." Elinor looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone, deciding whether a statement is correct or merely almost correct. "Yes," she said, after a pause long enough to mean she had weighed it properly. "That's the job." The crowd noise cut off from the flatbed. Knightsbridge went quiet, the particular brief silence of a London street between buses, and then the morning reasserted itself. A pigeon, a distant siren, the sound of the city getting on with it. Orbit stood at the center of the empty route and looked at nothing in particular with the calm, cooperative expression of a horse that had somewhere in the last 6 weeks stopped managing the world and started inhabiting it. Thomas wrote one line in his file. "Program complete. Horse cleared for ceremonial duty." Then he capped his pen, tucked the clipboard under his arm, and went to find the half apple he'd promised. The horses that carry the household cavalry through the streets of London do not arrive brave. They arrive young and green and startled by plastic bags. What happens between that Tuesday in April and a morning on Knightsbridge when a flag mounting drops and a horse checks in with his rider and keeps walking? That work is not visible to the 40,000 people behind the barriers. They see the plume and the polish and the absolute stillness of an animal that seems born for ceremony. They do not see the yards. They do not see the flags one at a time in the cold. They do not see the man standing at the shoulder saying nothing, simply being present and calm, and returning the next morning to do it again. They do not see the form with 4 words on it that somebody almost crossed out. They do not need to. That's what the work is for.